Welcome back. This is part two of Fallacies of Presumption. We're just going to keep right on going here. And so we're going to start with suppressed evidence, also known as cherry picking. This is when uh, you don't have all the evidence presented, or you're choosing the data. That's the cherry picking, choosing the data that suits what you want, or you read the news and you uh, only read what suits your preferences. Uh, Lots of us are listening to the news and we're hearing, COVID case in this school and COVID case in that town, and we're getting paying attention to all the positive cases, but not perhaps thinking about all the places, all the schools that are not getting COVID cases. So, are we getting a balanced picture of that? Is, I think, a question we should be asking ourselves. The presumption that's at the heart of this fallacy. Remember, we're doing fallacies of presumption. What's the presumption in something like cherry picking or suppressed evidence? The presumption is that the data presented fairly represents the available data. And so, or that the information being present is sufficient and that there isn't contrary evidence that's not being presented. So, the form X is sufficient information for Y, therefore Y is true, when if you had more information, you might be willing to retract that. So if you're ignoring contrary evidence, if you're not looking for negative evidence, if you're leaping to conclusions, it's possibly that this is what you're doing. Historically, the textbook case of suppressed evidence is the approximately 40-year case that the tobacco companies represented in court, represented in their advertising, represented in their defense against lawsuits, uh, made the case that there was no evidence that nicotine was addictive. Uh, Eventually, it was learned through whistleblowers and subpoena of expert information and so on. We now find out that those tobacco companies, at the same time they were saying, "Oh, there's nothing wrong with nicotine, not addictive at all," they were phoning up their plant breeders and saying, "Hey, you got to make some tobacco that has more nicotine in it because that stuff's really addictive and it's good for sales." So they were not sharing the data they had uh, with the public. And of course, now those companies have been held to some account, probably not enough, and we have much different laws. We have the exact same case this year when one of the revelations of the new Bob Woodward book is that at the same time President Trump was telling everyone it's just a flu, it's going to go away, everything's fine. He was on the phone to that reporter who had agreed not to publish until this fall that this thing's a killer. This is bad. This is a big deal. And so by not sharing that evidence, I would call that suppressed evidence. There's a thing we call, whether it be whitewashing, greenwashing. This is not giving the full picture. Uh, those of us in the agriculture industry have concerns about lots of things that are said about agriculture. There was a controversy a few years ago. I think it's died down a bit, but A&W has a long-running promotional campaign focused on health and purity of their food, and so they're advertising 100% pure beef raised without any added hormones or steroids, comes from ranchers who are committed to being leaders in sustainable production. And that sounds wonderful. But they didn't bother saying, "Oh, by the way, that's not in Canada, right? That's not. We're gonna buy Brazilian beef and we're gonna sell it in Canada, and put Canadian ranchers off our market." And so the editor of the Alberta Beef Magazine was like, "Well, we kind of wish that they would tell the public where the meat's really coming from." So I would call that suppressed evidence as well. Next fallacy, false dichotomy. That's a kind of a big word, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Other names are black and white fallacy, the either or fallacy, the false dilemma. And dichotomy is this word we use for the or, any statement has the word or in it. So maybe the best word, the best may not be this either or thing. So the form, either P or Q, it's not the case that P, therefore Q. We're going to do P's and Q's later. Maybe this is too abstract here. Let's look at some examples. You're either with me or against the troops. Well, President Bush, when you said that, probably about the time you guys were born, feeling kind of old doing this sometimes. Go ahead and laugh. It's okay. Well, actually, I'm neither, right? I'm not really on your side, but I'm not against the troops. So notice the statement doesn't allow, it's the fallacy works by saying you have to be one. You can't be both, you can't be neither. That's the false in this thing. And so it's false or false dilemma, false choice. That's what's going on here. And so we need to talk about that word or. The fancy university word for that, a statement that has the word or, is a disjunction. We're going to learn the logic of that in the propositional section of the course. But this word or, it's two lousy letters, and yet it's actually really complicated because it could mean one or the other but not both, or it could mean one or the other and possibly both. And if you don't believe me, look at the examples. Someone can ask you, do you want coffee or tea? Both is pretty much off the table, right? Yes, you could say neither, but it's clearly coffee or tea, pick one. Cream or sugar? Well, both is fine. So that one or the other but not both, or one or the other or both, those two different meanings we use for we use the same word for both of those. Now, this is another weird one because it's also a valid argument. And so we're going to, the validity stuff, we're going to park that until we get to later in the course. But for that reason, I can't give you that perfect counterexample. But consider this example. You can live in Toronto or Ottawa. I think that's possible. You don't live in Ottawa, so you must live in Toronto. And of course, we're thinking to ourselves, well, maybe there is someone in the class living in Toronto right now, but most of us are either in Winnipeg or in our homes around the world. So hello in Toronto if that's where you're at. But otherwise, I think the example works as this is an argument that is pretty unconvincing. So because this does have this valid nature, it kind of fools us into accepting it. If I have to choose one, if you accept that presumption, then you do get tossed into it. But just as in you don't have to live in only Toronto or Ottawa, you can live in Toronto or Ottawa, but you don't have to live in one of those two. There are other choices. So that's the presumption at the heart of this fallacy, is that you must choose one of the only two choices given. And you just reject that presumption, right? So, we must either cut social programs or have a huge deficit. We can't accept a deficit, so we must cut social programs. Well, wait a minute. How about neither of those things, right? Let's be smart here. You can have the one that always comes up in the environment. You can have jobs or trees, the economy or the environment. That's always how it's argued. The environment will have to look after itself, right? And there's lots of folks saying, listen, when it comes to the environment, it's good economics to look after it. You can have faith or accept the scientific orthodoxy that evolution is true. There's lots of people who think both sounds really great. And so these are some examples of how that false dichotomy, feeling like you're compelled to choose exactly one of two extreme choices, is a fallacy. So, some visuals: love it or leave it. And let's face it, some folks are going to do none of those things. And then this one, I forget the source of this, but it's kind of clever. Who do you love, Justin Bieber or God? As if those are your only two choices. Um, I suppose that might describe one person out there, Justin Bieber's mom, maybe. But otherwise, the rest of us can have both or neither. Complex question, also known as the loaded question. Next fallacy. So complex question is one with implied presumptions. So remember, you're asking a question. So if someone says, how do you like critical thinking as a conversation starter? That's a weird question if you aren't taking the course. When the cop pulls you over and says, do you know how fast you're going? They're not curious, right? They know how fast you're going. They want to know if you knew how fast you're going. Because if you say, and it's kind of human nature to say, yeah, kind of, you don't want to outright lie to them because but at the same time, so you probably say something like, yeah, I think it was, and then they kind of got you, right? Because you've pretty much at that point admitted that you knew how fast you were going and that it was too fast. Complex question is committed when a question is a false or disputed presupposition. So a question like, where were you when you pulled the trigger? That question only makes sense if you pulled the trigger. And, this is an important thing in legal processes that, when you're watching legal dramas, objection, that's a hypothetical question, or leading the witness, right? And that's exactly the sort of thing that goes, there are rules about asking questions that have presumptions hidden inside of them. If someone, if I was on trial for a heinous crime, and the prosecuting attorney said, "Well, if you had done the crime, would you have hidden the evidence?" Well, of course I would have. I'm not an idiot. Um, but if I say yes to that, it certainly seems like I'm guilty. And if I say no, then that has all sorts of different implications. So these complex questions, these loaded questions, are problematic. Why is this persuasive? I think that at the hub of it, we don't want to look like idiots. So when someone asks us something that we only sort of kind of know about, we tend to like to keep that on the down low. And so that missing information is something we're habituated to gloss over. And so when a new assumption slid into the conversation that we probably didn't want to have there, we tend not to sort of say, whoa, back up, right? When did this conversation suddenly become part about me doing that thing you're suggesting? Um, so that's the persuasiveness of this. The loaded question, some textbooks, some people treat complex and loaded questions exactly the same thing. I like to reserve loaded question for those where it is a complex question fallacy, but there is no good answer. So, have you stopped plagiarizing essays? I say to a student in the class. And if the student says no, sounds like you're still plagiarizing essays. And if you say yes, sort of sounds like you're committed to having done so in the past. And so that's the loaded question when um, it's going to go off in your face. So very famously, just recently, a reporter Date, I think is the way you say the name, um, asked President Trump, Mr. President, after 3.5 years, do you regret at all the lying you've done to the American people? Well, totally a loaded question, right? That's because if he says yes, he's admitting lying. If he says no, he's rejecting that he should regret the lies, right? This question has baked into it the presumption. Maybe it's not all that risky a presumption, but it's still a presumption that this has been lying. Lying is a complicated thing because it assumes sort of a access to a person's thoughts, right? Like when you're lying, but to anyone else you converse with, you have no idea if they're lying or if they're just wrong. And it's like so. There's a psychological state associated with lying. Only after this do we know. So that's why the Bob Woodward thing with the saying it's just a flu versus this is a killer is important because now we know he was lying because we know at the time that he was aware of the facts and chose to say something contrary to that. If we hadn't known that, we wouldn't know whether he's just, a BSer or just wrong. And there's a really great book called On Bullshit by a philosophy professor named Frankfurter that it really gets into the question of when is it a lie and when is it just bullshit? And it has to do with the psychology of it all, right? So someone who's a BSer doesn't really care whether it's true or not. And that's Trump sort of seems to satisfy that requirement. That is like he's just sort of indifferent to the truth or falsity of things. I think is Frankfurter's words. For a BSer is someone who's indifferent to the truth, where someone who lies knows the truth and deliberately tells you the opposite. Sorry, there's a little tangent on lying there. Anyway, I thought this was, I've given Trump a hard time plenty of times. Here's a time when he was fallacied by someone else. So a little bit of fair play there. Some simpler examples, have you quit using drugs? Again, it has that sort of, if I say yes, then it sounds like I used to. If I say no, it sounds like I still am. Likewise, why are you lying to me? Presumes the lie and is only looking for an explanation, which is a very different question than are you lying to me, is asking whether the lying is happening or not. Why are you lying? Presumes the lie and only seeks the explanation. These complex questions are a little bit tricky. They have a argument structure that's not typical. So they tend to be in the form of a question or implied question. So they, remember at the beginning I said, well, questions aren't really statements. So these things are sort of questions that are hidden inside of them, a implied presumption that is intended to be the conclusion you want the listener to walk away from the discussion with. So when Trump accuses, as he is right now, accusing Biden of being on some drugs, and there's a whole lot going on here. That's what I hear. So he never says it out front. He always just sort of implies that it's someone else is saying it. There's possibly drugs. That's the key part of the first paragraphs. Kind of funny that you can't even get out a sentence is itself an incomplete sentence. But then, how is it possible that he can go forward? There's the loaded question, right? So, and it's somehow tied to this drug business, and so he's implying if you think that question makes sense only if you think the drug thing is true. So that's what's going on there. So let's look at this. So now we have all of these fallacies going on, and we want to say, let's put it all together. Let's figure out, we got an argument. Well, I guess the first question is it an argument? And if it seems like it is, what's the premise? What's the conclusion? And then if we think it's a fallacy, can we figure out what fallacy it is? So, all persons in Canada have equal rights. Therefore, the University of Manitoba should admit this applicant regardless of their high school records. Huh. So there's actually a few things going on there. For one thing, I probably should have capitalized high school so that it's not that their school records are high, but rather that their their secondary records, right, or perhaps not. Maybe these grades aren't exactly fantastic, I think is what I'm supposed to be trying to say. We have a therefore, there's a logic indicator word. That helps us figure out, yeah, so it's probably an argument. And that helps us figure out, so the stuff after the therefore is probably the conclusion. And the premise, all persons in Canada have equal rights. Okay, that's fantastic. We're lucky to be in such a country. And then we should treat, I mean, it seems to be that we're then asking, so we should treat all applicants equally, right? Maybe is where this argument's going. We're going to do a little principal charity stuff here to figure out if it doesn't make perfect sense, just the way it looks, let's try to get an understanding of this argument that could make sense. So that's what we're doing here. We're saying, yeah, okay, now I get where this is coming from. So the argument is, since all persons in Canada have equal rights, the University of Manitoba should treat all applicants equally. Okay, now we got an argument that makes sense. Now, where would we go here? Is it a complex question? Well, I don't see anything in the form of a question, so I don't think so. Is it a false cause? Don't see any causal claims. I don't see circular reasoning, but it does seem to have this all, therefore, some character. So, boy, I'm thinking it's a generalization of some sort. Now, so then we have to think back. Okay, the premise is all, and that's universal. And then the conclusion is this applicant. So that's the sum. So that is a sweeping generalization. You got the all in the premise. So these are what we should be doing as we're working through whether the problems in the textbook. I guess if I was a good professor, I'd try to dig you up some examples. I'll see what I can do to come up with. Well, let me say this: there's a couple websites I know of that have self quizzes available, and I'll post those links in the Learn. There might be a document there already from last term that has them. I'll double check on that. And that's it for Fallacies of Presumption Part 2.